Thanks so much. It's such a privilege to be here today. Welcome to Montana virtually, Phill. Have you been to Montana before?
I have. I really enjoyed it. It was part of an extended road trip of all 50 U.S. states. But yeah, very pleased to have been to Montana.
I don't know many people who are the Chief Information Security Officer of Google Cloud, and I don't know many people who have been to all 50 states in the country. So that is impressive.
Right.
Well, I'm particularly excited to have the opportunity to be here and to interview you because I myself am the founder of a startup. It's a 15-year-old startup, so it's bootstrapped, and I feel like it still feels like a startup. But cybersecurity is so important for our startups. Really, we're the seeds of the future business economy. And so I'd love to start off by hearing about your work with startups. Can you tell us a little bit about, I know you've been on the board of a few different startups and you've worked with multiple startups to help them grow and succeed. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, the interesting thing about cybersecurity, especially, over the past couple of decades, is it's required such constant innovation that in many cases, it's only been the startup companies that have provided that innovation against a backdrop of not a lot of innovation from some of the massive companies in the industry. I think that's maybe changed a little bit now. And, of course, I'm biased speaking from a Google perspective. But generally speaking, I mean, over my career, in my prior life, I worked with startup companies right from them being kind of 1 to 2 person companies and grown their use inside what was a pretty large financial institution. And learned a lot from doing that on both sides. I think, as a buyer of services from startups, we learn a lot about how not to drive the startup too far too fast, and overexpose them to large enterprise requirements at the expense of what could be the otherwise natural growth of their business. And then today, I don't so much, the nature of Google is it's sometimes hard for us to use startups, particularly in the core part of our technology stack. But working directly and through our venture capital arm, Google Ventures, I sit on the board of a number of small, Series A, Series B startup companies, and it's great. It's great to work with founders, and then obviously in the context of Google, we have a big program to partner with startup companies to help companies grow on our infrastructure as well.
Yeah, and I have a couple questions for you about that later. I think our goal today is to provide practical tips to our community. So, but first, I know you see a lot in your role. Can you tell us what do you see as the major risks that startups need to protect against today? And feel free to share any war stories from your experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I would say is try and avoid being a target of opportunity. So when you look at the threats out there, you probably all read about this every day. It's everything from attackers of various forms stealing intellectual property or stealing proprietary data or committing financial fraud in many respects by convincing people to wire money to different places, all the way through to perhaps what's the most prevalent at the moment is ransomware, where attackers will take over an environment, steal data, encrypt what is remains, and generally put you out of operation until you pay a ransom. That's one of the most common things going on in small organizations, all the way up to massive organizations. And the good and the bad thing about that is that most organizations affected by that are simply targets of opportunity. You're not likely to attract the attention of an organized criminal group. But if you sit there obviously vulnerable, connected to the internet, some scan will come along and find your vulnerability, and then somebody will exploit that. The reason there's kind of some good news about that is if you maintain a reasonable level of basic defenses, then you're not going to be a target of opportunity, and the attackers are going to go do that to somebody else. And when I say kind of basic defenses, it's having stronger authentication, so using kind of multi-factor authentication or or codes delivered to a phone or an authentication app or one of those plug-in keys. basically not just sitting there with an easy to guess password with your entire infrastructure connected to the internet, all the way through to making sure you have good and tested backups in case something does bad happens, that you can kind of recover from that, and a whole bunch of things in between. But I don't think most businesses don't need to have super advanced defenses. You just need to not be a target of opportunity.
That makes sense. I think today one of the challenges for startups is that there is that laundry list of things that you see as important for security. There's multi-factor authentication, there's backups, there's endpoint protection, there's cybersecurity training, there's pen test. I mean, it's exhausting. What are your like top three?
Yeah, like I think the main thing is, and I'm going to try and avoid this being a sales pitch for Google and all of our services, but use a service provider as much as you can. Again, I'm not doing this as a sales pitch. I'm just using an example because I kind of work at Google. But Google Workspace to get all your kind of your email, your documents, everything managed. Big companies like us invest a ton in providing security services, so that the people who use those services don't have to know how to configure them and manage them. And then there's a whole array of companies. Again, I'm sure many of you use various payment services, invoicing services. Just using companies like reputable, well-audited companies that have got all of the right controls, and trying to use as many of those as possible. And then the main thing is those companies, and again, us included, offer a whole set of security services, and increasingly we're enabling them by default so that people don't have to make a choice about this. Try not to turn those security things off in the name of convenience, unless it really, really is painful, and there generally isn't, is just taking advantage of the default security, not turning it down, because we've usually put that default in for some good reason that people are getting attacked. And so I think try and using service providers as much as possible. And if you're not happy with the security of one service provider, let's say you're working with a payments company and you see in the news that they're regularly getting hacked, then switch payments companies. There's a lot of competition out there, and we all would like improvements in security to be a competitive edge, and that's definitely worth moving away from companies that don't have good security.
Well, I love that your answer there was basically leverage the cloud. And even though you're biased, you're 100% right. Small businesses can't afford to be managing their own software in a secure way. You just don't have the staff. You don't have the resources. So definitely leverage the resources that cloud providers have. That is great advice. And we do see a lot of people turning off those defaults and getting into trouble. Do you think that there are resources often in cloud-based systems that are available to startups and other businesses that they don't take advantage of?
Yeah, I mean, I give you an example again, just speaking from our perspective. So, Gmail, we have a thing in Gmail, and actually, bad on us in a little way, and I'll, and kind of Philip Britton will be familiar with this from past history, is we probably don't market some of these things as much as we actually should. So in Gmail, there's a thing, for example, called the Advanced Protection Program, which basically sets you up so that you can only access your Gmail using one of those kind of tokens or an authenticator app on your phone. And we do all sorts of extra protection around that to stop you being visiting known bad websites and a whole bunch of other things. And you can effectively get that and switch that on for almost no effort. The only effort is, when you log in occasionally, you have to do something extra with an authenticator app rather than just type in a password. But that's probably an extra 1.5 seconds for a whole lot of protection. And I think there's a lot of services that are provided that have these more advanced level of protection. We're trying to implement them more by default, as I mentioned before, but sometimes just a quick search on that website of that vendor or or just a quick overall Google search will reveal if they've got more advanced settings you can just switch on that basically give you that higher level of defense for almost no cost, and usually no cost, but almost no effort.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times folks aren't taking advantage of the security options that are in there. So you told me something that surprised me that I think is a great resource for people. A lot of times startups feel like when it comes to big cloud providers, it's almost like David and Goliath. Like, how do I get their attention? How do I get what I need? And you mentioned that Google actually has a concierge service for startups and that other cloud providers may have the same. Can you share Google's service as an example, why you have it, what kind of resources they provide? And hopefully that'll be a model that we can use for other cloud providers we may work with as well.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So we have a whole Google for Startups team, and again, like you said, the other cloud providers and many other types of companies have the same thing where we can assign people to work with startup companies, and we have almost like different blueprints of how to use our products in ways that are appropriate for startup companies, as opposed to exposing companies to the whole range of products that, say, like a massive bank or a massive retailer may need to use. And so we have almost like an entry path, including in many cases credits that people can use to get themselves set up before, while they demonstrate value and grow, before they become a full paying ongoing customer. So think of it like an on-ramp where we provide guardrails and guidance and blueprints for how to get up and running. And clearly this is in our self-interest. We want every company to get on Google Cloud, to grow massively so that they can become a wonderful paying customer in the future with thousands of employees and hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. So it's not entirely altruistic, but we do put that together to get companies up and running, because we believe there's a huge amount of growth for everybody in small companies becoming bigger companies.
Sounds like a win-win to me. So how can our audience get access to that? Do we all just email you, or do we Google a concierge service? Or
yeah, well, what we'll do is we'll get some links pulled together and send that out to the group. So we'll get the right links. Yeah.
Sounds good. So as our startups grow, obviously, I'm sure you would agree, there's a difference between security that gets bolted on after the fact and security that's kind of grown organically over time. Do you have any recommendations as our startups grow for how they can and should approach security program management?
Yeah, so I think I don't think many organizations, until they grow to a certain size, should really, and this maybe go against expectations of what I should say, but I don't think many organizations, until they're much larger size, need to have a dedicated security leader. So there's, medium to large enterprises have these roles like chief security officer. I don't think many organizations actually need one of those. If you've got somebody that looks after IT for you, making sure that they're paying attention to the security needs and requirements, then I think that's often good enough. Doing things like we've talked about, making sure you're using reputable services and taking advantage of the security defaults that are there. It does get a little bit more complicated if you're in a business that is working with large organizations that then kind of audit and assess you and send you long questionnaires about your security. One of the things you'll find, though, is many of your service providers may be able to help you with that. So, like, for example, if you were building something on Google Cloud and you're delivering some service to some bank, for example, and they send you a security questionnaire, we have a whole set of pre-canned things about how to answer that in the context of running on Google Cloud. And Amazon and Microsoft and everybody else has a similar thing. So I don't think you need to overthink this until you're of a certain scale, or unless you're at a lower scale in a very regulated market where essentially your business is about being good at demonstrating compliance to things.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because obviously we've seen a lot of supplier attacks recently. That's been in the news a lot. And that's definitely been leading to increased vetting, which can be a hurdle. And sometimes it comes very quickly at small businesses and startups where you don't expect to have this questionnaire. It needs to be answered in like 2 days, or you might lose that client. So it's great to know that there's a resource within Google for recommendations for how to answer that if you are in Google Cloud. So hopefully we'll be able to pass along a link or some information about that as well. Also curious to get your take. I know back when I was starting my company, we had a fractional CFO and fractional marketing team. And these days, we're certainly seeing the trend of fractional or virtual chief information security officers as well. Do you think that's a viable approach for our startups?
Yeah, I think it is, especially to your point before, when you're in a business that's getting regularly assessed by your customers, or you're expected to be able to pass some kind of audit certification, or if you're handling personally identifiable or other privacy critical information, I think it's useful to make sure that you've got access to some service, just like you, exactly to your point, just like you would with an accountant or a lawyer or some other professional advisor. And there's a number of fairly good services on this, but I think it's I think a combination of that plus trying to rely on others to do all of your IT for you is probably the easiest path on all of these things.
Absolutely. Do you feel that security can be a competitive edge for businesses in some cases?
I think it can be in some respects, although I think often it's one of those things that people just take for granted until it becomes apparent it was never there in the first place. And
Right.
so I think what can though differentiate you as a company serving bigger companies, if you're providing a great service that that company wants and you are able to demonstrate um, compliance and security that doesn't require that big company to like sign off a whole bunch of exceptions because you don't quite meet the criteria, then that can be a competitive edge if you're able to demonstrate compliance with what they expect better than some of the other small companies that you may be competing with for that large customer. Again, when you're inside these big companies, they're often doing all these assessments, and unless you have such a unique offering that they really have to use you, oftentimes the bureaucracy in these big companies is going to pivot towards the company that's easiest to work with, and in some cases that might be the one that's easiest to check the box that they have all the right compliance and security.
Makes sense. Let's turn our attention to a hot topic, artificial intelligence. Obviously, the cybersecurity industry has always evolved quickly, but it seems like AI is going to be a game changer. From a security perspective, how do you think AI will either help or hurt startups and small businesses?
Well, I think focusing on the attacks that come from AI, I think at the moment, to be honest, I think the media is kind of overhyping how the bad guys are using AI. There's people claiming that AI is being used to create new types of computer viruses and many other things. And the reality is that's just actually not the case today. But what AI is being used for by the bad guys is to create better phishing emails or better social engineering emails that try and con you into doing something. So, we've all had those emails that say, I'm your CEO, please wire all this money from here to here. And, and it's full of spelling mistakes and other issues. And, it comes from the wrong email address. And so you can easily dismiss that. But what attackers are doing is they're using generative AI in particular to generate more realistic and effective social engineering emails that are more likely to make you susceptible to being conned. The answer to that is not necessarily deploying AI against that. It's actually just using strong forms of authentication. So for example, like we talked about before, tokens or other things that mean that if you happen to disclose a password, it doesn't really have impact. And then similarly, if people are attempting to dupe you into wiring money to different places, then setting up some controls in your company so that you work with your bank and that they have to verify additional verification and provide some additional controls so you're less susceptible to that kind of wire fraud type event. And most banks, small and large, give you capabilities to do that. And then also there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on where attackers are using AI to generate misinformation, disinformation, cause societal concern. But one of the other things that happens again is there's been a small number of these attacks where they'll create fake images that may cause people to think that they're working with somebody that is authentic that really isn't. So I think it's just continue to be appropriately suspicious in your interactions with people, especially where movements of large amounts of money are concerned. And then you can often get advice from your bank about how to defend against those kind of things. But longer term, though, I think ultimately, I don't think small companies are really going to need to use AI for cyber that much. It's mainly big companies like us that are deploying AI to increase our levels of defense that we can then wrap around all of the companies that are running on our platform. So, for example, today we're already using AI to analyze attacks, to make sure that we're constructing defenses to get ahead of those attacks even quicker. So if an attacker attacks us in one place, anywhere in the world, or touches any one of our 4 billion users, we're quickly learning from that and putting defense across everybody else to all of the 4 billion users before those attackers have a chance to go from that first person to the next person. And AI lets us get to that level of speed. So that's, it's defense at scale is really going to help.
So really, it sounds like we need to think about who we're choosing for our suppliers and make sure that they are leveraging AI to defend us. And I think you're right. I mean, attackers are already leveraging artificial intelligence to get better at social engineering. Back to your comment about targets of opportunity. I'm curious, have you played with Worm GPT at all, the attacker toolkit that they're using to write nasty code, and one of the attacker toolkits, and that can craft phishing emails? We were just playing with it in our lab here.
Yeah, I've not seen that one in particular, but I've seen plenty of similar things, and it's very, very effective. The way I look at this is AI makes novice attackers be good attackers, and it makes good attackers be expert attackers. So it's like in our use of AI in businesses, it kind of democratizes talent and scales talent, and the bad guys get that the same as the good guys. Right.
It really levels the playing field for the bad guys, so that it's easier for them to jump in. Don't get any ideas, you guys. But I think it's similar to what happened during COVID in Montana in some ways, where so many people were more open to using Zoom. People were traveling less, and it really opened up the economy or opportunities even more for us to collaborate with people around the country and around the world. So technology changes the economy. Okay, so you also mentioned deep fakes and other voice social engineering. I'm curious to know a little bit more about your thoughts on that, if you've seen any attacks in the wild, or if that's something that Google is protecting against and thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, we see a lot of that, when we look at how work across our YouTube business, and some of our other businesses, we're always looking for how that content might be abused to generate fake content, which is then used in other contexts. A lot of our tools that people use to generate images and video and voice, we actually embed watermarks in that content, so people can then filter on that so that they know that's AI generated content. I think a lot of other providers do that, and then we also have a bunch of tools that you can then filter out AI generated content, so people can be on guard for what might be a fake image. But it's certainly, I mean, we've got an election coming up in a few months that's just going to be rife with fake voice, fake video, fake images, and I think all of the big tech companies and social media platforms are going to be working pretty hard to figure out how to filter out and manage that while still preserve the ability for everybody else to send legitimate content around. It's just going to be a very, very challenging problem, and I think ultimately everybody will learn their own ways of being able to filter out what's real and what isn't real. But certainly from a technology perspective, we're going to have to do a lot of work on that.
Yeah, I think the election is definitely going to make it so that the technology for deep fakes is pushed forward. And we're already starting to hear about scams where callers fake someone's voice to get them to move money or things like that. So maybe a big takeaway here for startups is, number one, anyone in a financial role or an executive role or an HR role really needs to be on the lookout for any deep fakes that are trying to get them to move money or things like that. And all of us need to be critical of information and aware that disinformation campaigns exist.
Well, the other, as you'll know, the other nasty scam that happens, because now it used to be the case on some of these AI models, I would need like 10 minutes of your voice to be able to train a model. Now I just need 5 seconds of your voice, and I can create a model that's a perfect impersonation of. And one of the real nasty things that happens, it's like a scam where people call you up. They have a voice, a fake voice of, say, one of your kids, and they're saying like, Mom, Dad, I'm in jail, you need to send some money here, and it just sounds like them. And of course, you panic and people send money. This is particularly targeted against the older population that are not familiar with this. One of the things that interesting, I do, for my son, I basically, we've learned a shared secret number, so that if ever I get a call from him that says, why am I some money? I'm in trouble. I'm going to go what's the secret number? So everybody's going to have to develop these little techniques to authenticate each other in the face of some of these scams. I think we're definitely in a new world, and no matter what we do with the tech, you are going to have to just learn a new set of things to defend ourselves from scams, just like we do in every evolution of technology.
That is so funny because my dad that did that with me in the 80s, except it was a word. And it was a different, it was like, don't fall for somebody trying to pick you up at school. It was just the same kind of thing, but different types of scams.
Yep.
So I'm curious to know about your war stories. By the way, we have your voice now, Phill, so watch out.
Well, on the flip side of this, this is actually one of the things I really worry about is a societal level is the plausible deniability this gives people. So you can imagine at some point there's going to be a politician that is caught doing something really, really bad, and it's true, but they're going to go, well, that was a deep fake, it wasn't me. And, which is kind of, I think there's ultimately, I worry about the flip side of this, the plausible deniability that occurs for things that have actually happened. Right.
We saw that in an election hack, I think in 2016. It was a 2016 hack where someone's email got dumped and they were like, oh, I didn't send that email, but it was DKIM signed and cryptography. It'll be interesting to see how we can authenticate video and voice, because I think that's another area of emerging technology that we will be able to take advantage of. Okay, I would love to hear a war story before we break for Q&A. Do you have any cases of startups, tell me a case where something went wrong and there was something we can learn from it?
Yeah, I mean, the one we see a lot, and it's not even just startups. I mean, I've unfortunately helped support some massive companies that have had the same issue. So this is this whole ransomware issue where somebody breaks into your system, encrypts all your data, and then you have to pay them a ransom, and to get the data back to keep your business running. And the thing that happens a lot is companies think they've got backups, and they've never tested the backups. Mm-hmm. And then when it comes to use the backups in anger, in a case of an actual ransomware, they realize, oh crap, it doesn't actually work, and they should test them. Or the backups have the data in it, but they don't have the software that the organization needs to run. So they can bring their data back, but they still can't actually run their business. Or they can bring their data back, but there's some other things that are missing that prevents them from actually getting up and running. And so I think, nobody's too big or too small to just once in a while actually, get some machines or some blank cloud instances and just test that you can kind of reboot your company. And I've sat literally, I obviously won't name them. A year ago, I sat with a very, very large company and said, have you done this? And the chief information officer of this very, very large company said, no, my team are great. They told me all the backups are fine. I went, just humor me. Have them do this test of an actual ransomware recovery as opposed to a conventional bring your data back from a backup. And lo and behold, they couldn't do it. And so they've now changed a lot of stuff about that because they had false confidence. So if I was going to do one thing, I'd just really make sure your backups work.
You are preaching to the choir. I don't know if you know, but at LMG we do ransom negotiation, and we've done that since 2017, I think, the early days. And we see all of those things, especially to smaller companies, because you want to just check that checkbox and move on. We also see sometimes backups are in the cloud, and you don't realize if your whole infrastructure is down, it might take a week or two just to restore from all of it at once, and you're going to be down during that time frame. Right. So backups are key, multi-factor authentication we mentioned, leverage the cloud and make sure you're taking advantage of those resources for security that we have in the cloud. I think those are three big takeaways here.
Yeah. Well, and actually to your point about the time it takes to recover these things, I think that's a good point, because sometimes it's important to distinguish between the stuff you need to be running your business day to day versus all of your other stuff. So I'll just kind of make up a random example. Imagine you're a video production company and you've got like 10 active projects, making sure that you've got backups of those things that could be brought back in like hours, but your entire past 5 years back catalog that you don't need to bring that back really quickly. But you don't want it all mixed together, so that the things that you really need get munged together with the stuff that's going to take weeks to recover. So thinking about what it takes to run your business day to day versus all of your information is a useful optimization.
I'm so glad you said that, because that gets to this core issue of what data do you have and what's important, and maybe even getting rid of stuff you don't need. And that is actually way easier to do when you're a startup than by the time you're 2, 3, 4, 5 years out. You're going to have like your garage is going to be full of all kinds of clutter, and it's really hard to clean out. So you guys, now is the time to think about what data do you have and what is truly important to run your business, and just like categorize that and keep track of it. And remember, the more data you have, the more you're storing, the more risk you have, and the more your storage costs are, and the longer it'll take to restore backups and things like that. So with that, anything else you want to add, Phill, before we turn it over to our audience?
No, good. Let's go for questions.
All right, come at us.
Philip, I see you have your hand up. Do you have a few words to say? Thank you so much.
So first, a few words, just very quick. Thank you both. That was a truly super discussion, super enlightening, engaging, and thought-provoking. Maybe most importantly, I do have a question for Phill. It's really sort of two related questions. One is, we've seen for decades what's basically, an increase in the frequency and intensity of cyber attacks, and then a corresponding increase in cyber defensive capabilities. And it's been this arms race. Attackers raise the bar, defenders raise the bar, attackers raise, and it's just been this almost, this increase. I won't say it's linear, but constantly increasing. Do you, when you look out into the future, 10 years, 20 years from now, is that just what happens forever and ever and ever? Or, do you see any possibility that game fundamentally pivots in some way? And then my related question, or you can decide if it's related or not, is just what the implication for cybersecurity as an industry. I speak every semester to a class full of students, of computer science students at Montana State. And a couple of sessions ago, I was asked, "Oh, Philip, do you think cybersecurity is going to be a good and growing industry?" I'm like, "Oh my God, yes, it is much needed, and the intensity is growing all the time." So I think it is. But I'd love to get your view of that, in the light of the first part of the question.
Yeah, so I'm short-term pessimistic and long-term optimistic. So I think we've still got a number of years of pain ahead of us. There's still a lot of tech companies out there that everybody uses that doesn't have the level of security that's the best default. There's still a lot of, I don't know, payments companies and some other companies that have great claims of security that don't quite live up to it. But they're all, the natural kind of evolution is sorting all of those out. I think we're also inventing more technologies that have better usability and high levels of security. So, people like me always say, don't use passwords, but then what's the reality is you've got to use all these clunky these like plug-in keys, and Google says use this one, and your bank says use another one, and another company says use another one. I think we're inventing a bunch of technologies now. For example, there's a thing we've invented with Apple and some other companies called passkeys, which lets you get stronger authentication on your mobile device. And when you change your mobile device or upgrade it or replace a phone, it's not an absolute nightmare to reset all of those keys and stuff, which is what keeps people away from you. So we're getting better and better at that kind of stuff. And we're getting better and better at making kind of backups easier so that you can get comfortable with it without all the and then we're also behind the scenes in the IT industry, we're inventing new types of running software and new types of hardware that just build stuff in. So I'll give you an example. Apple do this, but I'll give the Google example. We've built really sophisticated things into the new Google Pixel phones that just make it so much harder for even sophisticated nation states to break those phones and get access to the camera and your data and other stuff. So we're raising the bar all the time. But in the reason, that's why I'm long-term optimistic that we're going to change this. But I'm short-term pessimistic because there's just so much stuff to upgrade. And there's so much stuff like in our legacy environments or in environments in industrial control systems, or like things that are built into aircraft and ships and other things that you just don't upgrade as quickly as you upgrade other things. So there's a lot of stuff to work through, but we're definitely making progress. So I think there's always going to be a cybersecurity industry, but I think some of the more basic problems are going to go away in the next 5 years. But certainly we're in a world of pain for the next few years.
The progress that you guys are making, I think, is indicative of a real shift in our industry right now. It's almost like if you think about the construction industry, there was a time before 2x4s and standardized sizes of lumber. And without that, you couldn't have safety standards or standards for inspections or things like that. And tech is so young. It seems like our larger tech companies are just right now creating those basic fundamental building blocks so that we can build upon it. Really exciting work that you're doing with passkeys, by the way. That is going to be game changing.
Right.
Okay, so we'll start the Q&A, and I've already had the group from Missoula tell me they've got a question there. So let's go over to kick off the Q&A in Missoula.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks, Sherri and Phill, for the wonderful conversation. Can you hear us okay?
Yep.
Super. I'm going to pass it over to someone in the room.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for your time. We really appreciate you meeting with us today. Question that I have is, in addition to AI, what are other emerging cyber threats that startups and small businesses should concentrate on?
I don't think there's anything really kind of emerging. I think it's just keeping going on implementing some of the the basics we talked about, making sure that you're not relying just on simple passwords, that you've got backups, all of the essential core controls. I think if you do that, you're not a target of opportunity, and unless you're in somehow in some industry that causes you to be targeted, you're probably going to be okay. I think the way to think about attackers, I always like to describe it as attackers have bosses and budgets just like the rest of us. And, they're rational economic actors. I mean, if you're, this typically happens in these organized criminal gangs, they'll just scan the internet or, for open vulnerabilities. They'll create that list of targets. They'll pass it on to somebody else. It's like a business flow in itself, who will then try and exploit that, and they'll find a weakness and they'll sell that weakness to somebody else. And so if you're the one company that's like not an obvious target, they're going to move on and they're going to go focus on something else. So it doesn't mean that you won't ultimately be compromised if you have such sensitive information that you do become a target. But most companies are just not a target. They're a target of opportunity. And if you maintain that just base level of defense, you're going to be fine.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, I guess the way we'll moderate this is we'll just go to those of you that have your hand raised, and I see Greg in Missoula has his hand raised, so go ahead.
Sorry, Jenny, are you talking this Greg?
Yes, or sorry, I said Greg in Missoula, I meant Bozeman.
Right. Bozeman. Thanks, both of you. So my name's Greg. This question is really for both of you. So you mentioned the growing need to understand whether or not a piece of content is authentic or original. right? And Sherri, I think you mentioned cryptography, some sort of watermarking technology, dare I say, maybe even blockchain. I haven't seen any of this rolled out yet. And given how kind of growingly important it is, how close or far away are we from having some sort of a technology where each one of us, or at least at the corporate level, can begin to watermark things?
Well, first of all, we already have, I mean, it's almost like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. The power has been with you all along. Digital signing and public key encryption has been around for decades now. And I was actually just at the RSA conference talking about the fact that I cryptographically, digitally sign every email I send out. And my team knows that if they get an email that looks like it's from the CEO, but it is not digitally signed, then it's not from me. And so we really have the ability to undermine phishing attacks, a lot of them. And actually, I'd be curious to know, Phill, your perspective on whether we might see that a digital signing integrated in Gmail at some point, because it seems like it's harder to do than it needs to be. We obviously already have public PKI and certificates and things like that. When we surf the web, you can see that lock. It's possible to do in email, but it's harder and it's less accessible to startups and small businesses.
Yeah, so the other thing is that there's a thing called the C2PA,
That
which
was
is,
next on my list. I love it.
yeah, which is the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. So c2pa.org. And what this is an organization set up by like Adobe, Microsoft, Google, media organizations. And they've actually been working with camera and camera sensor vendors. And the idea of this is that real world authentic content, particularly from news organizations, will be signed at the very point of which that video was recorded. And the idea ultimately here is, if you're a CEO of a company or a political leader, you'll basically say the only thing that is real is the thing that carries my C2PA signature from authentic sources, and that way you can just deny everything else and say this is the authentic stuff. And so a lot of big Fortune 500 companies as well as political organizations are already making sure that when their CEOs speak or they do their press releases or their financial results announcements, it's all C2PA signed. And then a lot of us on the tech side, we're implementing controls to automatically validate that. So there'll be some stuff coming in Google search where it'll flag or in YouTube, it'll flag if you're watching something that isn't appropriately signed. And Sherri, to your point, we're also making it easier and easier to flag inauthentic things in Gmail. So I'm having a world of fun at the moment, not in a good way, because we're changing Gmail such that any organization that sends out more than 5,000 emails a day, and this typically won't affect you all, this is more like the big companies who don't sign their emails and run a secure email infrastructure, we're blocking them from Gmail. So I'm not very good friends with some very large companies at the moment that are having to do some work on their infrastructure to fulfill our criteria so that we protect Gmail users from fake stuff, but also from badly formed, actually official corporate stuff that actually do need to apply signatures to their email. So there's a lot of stuff that we're using our position in the industry with our billions of Gmail users to try and shape these things. But there's a lot of work going on, but it's like the quote says, the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. It's gonna take a while for it to become pervasive. And but what you see now is all of the content generators like the AI companies, us, Adobe, a lot of the AI content is having these signatures on it, not just for authenticity, so that you can flag and detect something that is AI created. Of course, it doesn't stop the ability to detect things that are malevolently produced, but it gives us a bit of a control framework.
That is so exciting. Like right now, even though we sign all our emails, some companies can't process that properly. So having a push from you guys is going to be huge. And for those of you that may not be familiar with key signing, the bird's eye view is there's a pair of keys and and that's like really just a file. What one key signs, the other key can verify. So you can put one out in the world that everyone can use to verify, but you have your secret. And if you sign something, people can verify it's really from you.
Yeah. And actually, you know, to that point, one of the things, and we don't expect really anybody to have to do anything with that. We try and make it automatic. But one of the things that's interesting, it's funny, I just had a conversation with, you know, one of my kind of banks that I use last year, where I kept getting warnings in Gmail that the email was not authentic. And I called up the bank, and the bank said, "Oh, you just have to change this setting in Gmail to switch off all of the security." And I went, like, "Hell no!" And
Are you a
you
pain
know,
in the neck
and
for your bank
you
too?
know, and I ended up switching banks, you know, because the only way that their email infrastructure could send stuff to Gmail was if I switched off security in Gmail. And so it's that kind of stuff to be on the lookout for. Yeah.
Great, we've got one question here in Bozeman. Jeff?
Yeah, hi Phil, hi Sherri. I feel like we've talked a lot about kind of transactional attacks today. I'm curious what your thoughts are on kind of some of the more long game attacks we've seen, like with SolarWinds or XC utils, and what your perspective is on that kind of attack going forward.
Yes, so certainly the attacks in the software supply chain. I mean, again, for those that you don't know, there was an attack. So most organizations, even big tech companies like us, you know, use open source software that's just widely available. I mean, it's, you know, been one of the great innovations in the past couple of decades that we can do that. But the downside is it means there's potential for people to slip bad things into that software. And it's not just open source, as you mentioned with SolarWinds, that was kind of closed source proprietary. And some attackers are very, very patient about doing that. And so, again, I don't think it's really, you know, small organizations won't and shouldn't have to have the capability to defend against that. What we're doing as an industry is looking for that and trying to protect that. So I'll give you an example. We set up with some other tech companies a thing called the Open Source Security Foundation, and we fund it, as do other companies. And what we do is we look and constantly look through all of the open source software, look to see who the maintainers are we giving them the tools to protect things, how we're reviewing things. You know, we, as part of that XZ issue, we're doing a lot of analysis to going like, you know, why that got caught sort of accidentally. We're looking now about how we could catch things like that more systematically and reliably. But there's a lot of focus in the industry, and but there are definitely those kind of long-term steady attacks that are more sophisticated, that are typically perpetrated by nation states as part of a longer game to attack sophisticated targets as opposed to target everybody.
Great, I see Philip has his hand up again.
Yes, all right. Got another question. So one of the areas of focus we have in around Bozeman particularly is quantum computing, thanks in large part to the world-class material sciences department we have at Montana State University. And we have one of the only full-fledged quantum computing test beds in the country based here in Bozeman. You may not know that. You know, in addition to AI, quantum has for years now been talked about another potential game changer for security and privacy, both as, you know, as a weapon for the bad guys and also potentially as a way of yet raising the bar again on defenses. I'm curious what your thoughts are on quantum and the effect on cybersecurity.
Yeah, so you know, for everybody's benefit, if a sufficiently powerful quantum computer existed, it's what's called a cryptographically relevant quantum computer. If one existed at a sufficient scale, it could break all of the encryption that we all rely on today to secure everything.
It would destroy security as we know it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's basically, you know, if tomorrow we woke up and there was such a computer, you know, it would be pretty existential. The good news is, unless Philip, the team in Montana have got a radical invention up their sleeve tomorrow, we don't think such a computer will exist until, you know, we think it's about 2035. You know, it could be 2030, it could be 2040. You know, I say that a little bit guardedly because it's no longer a physics problem, it's now an engineering problem, and engineers have a habit of surprising us on the upside. But I think, from what we know in our own development of our quantum capability, it's, again, more likely to be in the 2030 plus timeframe. The good news is NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, this year are releasing new cryptographic standards that are capable of defending against a quantum computer. The downside is we all have to implement and upgrade all of that. Again, I suspect it's not a lot of what any of you will have to do. We'll just build it into the infrastructure. In fact, at Google, we're already deploying this into Google Cloud, Android, Google Chrome browser as part of just trialing this, making sure that we're able to support it in the appropriate way. But there is going to be a big race over the next few years to essentially upgrade all of this technology for the planet ahead of 2030 to 2035. It's going to be interesting.
Well, and Phill, I think not all suppliers are going to be on top of this as Google is. And so really the way it's going to affect a lot of startups is we need to think about what cloud providers are we relying on, and are they ready for this,
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think we're also going to see a little bit of a spurt. So when NIST announced these standards and published them in a few months, there's going to be a flurry of activity from regulators going after healthcare, banks, and the big companies to say, tell us your plan to adopt this. And there'll be some kind of trickle down in vendor assessment questionnaires that'll, I don't mean to sound cynical, but will probably be mostly pointless, that everybody checks the boxes to make sure everybody's got a plan. And I think for most of you, if you end up in, say, 3 months' time, having some random question from some large company about this, I think you should just respond that you're reliant on your service providers to deliver you this capability, right?
Yeah, or cyber insurance applications too. I think that's also a pressure for startups and small businesses.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
There was a bit of chatter in the chat when you had talked about deep fakes and cameras. So one of the questions is there coding on cameras? Does that show up in the metadata? Or if not in the metadata, where does that show up?
Yes, so the C2PA work is basically depending how there's multiple layers to this. So for example, every C2PA compliant cameras have a key embedded in the camera sensor at manufacture time, so that every image or video stream produced by that camera is digitally signed by that key. So you can tie it not only to authenticity, you can tie it back to like the particular device that took it, and then that's embedded in the metadata, but it's tied to the image itself, so you can't break apart the metadata in the image. So it's a reasonably well thought through standard, and if people use it correctly, it's pretty good. But it is a heavy lift, and it's not really designed. Ultimately, we and others will probably commoditize it such that it can just be default tied into every kind of Android or iPhone device or something. But at the moment, it's really just for these high-end use cases for news organizations like the BBC, for example, are already producing most of their content with these signatures. I think the White House, every presidential briefing is signed with this stuff. I think there's a few Fortune 100 companies that every CEO appearance has these signed, but it's not really commoditized enough for general use yet.
Okay, great answer. Thank you. Well, I think that is probably our time today.